Charles Sanders Peirce is an American philosopher who never really got much recognition, even though he's arguably the greatest American philosopher. He ended up living in a small house in eastern Pennsylvania for much of his life. He hung around Harvard for quite a while, but never got a faculty position at Harvard. Ended up really doing a lot of scientific work, trained at Johns Hopkins, but nevertheless really sort of lived out most of his life as a hermit. And so it's an odd story. Nevertheless, he was somebody with incredibly powerful ideas, and he was the founder of a philosophical movement known as Pragmatism. Now maybe we can explain it by starting with the relationship between mind and the world. Here is somebody having a thought, and in this case, better than that's a triangle, looking at the cat drinking from the glass. This happens all the time in my house, by the way. I get a glass of water, and immediately a cat comes over and starts drinking it. And so now I get cats their own water. So I think, all right, one water for me, one for the cats. That sometimes works, but I have to use the same glass for them all the time, because they recognize that as the cat glass. And if I use something else, then they immediately get confused and bring up. But anyways, here is my cat Zadok drinking my drink. Okay, so the cat drinks water from the glass. Okay, I'm having that thought, and that's the scene that I'm having a thought about. Well, we've talked about this traditional view, as in Aristotle, within the Yaya philosophers in India. The world consists of things, objects, substances. They have properties, they stand in relations, they exist in space and time. They do things, they have things done to them. And corresponding to that is a theory of truth. At one point, Aristotle defined truth when things are as we say they are, essentially. Or in other words, our thoughts and utterances correspond to the world. So I say the cat is drinking water from the glass, and the cat is drinking water from the glass. I say that's a triangle, and that is a triangle. There's some kind of match between what I say and the way the world is. There are other ways of putting things. For example, Russell says a sentence is true if and only if it corresponds to a fact. And so he thinks there's a fact in the world, the cat drinking water from the glass, and my sentence corresponds to that fact. Or there's a fact that that shape on the slide is a triangle. And then I can say, aha, that's a triangle. It's true because it corresponds to that fact. Here's yet another way of putting it, which is a way that Aquinas tends to use. We could say a sentence is true if and only if it maps onto the world. Now, what do I mean, it maps onto the world? Well, I can take its parts. For example, that is a triangle. I say that means that shape. Map that word that onto that shape. And then triangle, map that onto a particular kind of shape. And you realize, aha, that maps onto the world the correct way. Or the cat is drinking water from the glass. Same thing. The phrase the cat actually maps onto the cat. And then water, that maps onto what's in the glass. The glass, that maps onto the glass that's containing the water. And then the cat drinking, the drinking corresponds to the cat going. So, gosh, yes, you've got this function, you might say, that goes from the various linguistic items to things in the world. We've got this actually, well, standing in a correspondence where the names represent objects and the objects do stand in the corresponding relations, the relations mentioned by those linguistic items. That's called the picture theory of language. Now, all of this is sort of commonsensical. It's something that philosophers from Aristotle to Aquinas to Descartes to, most of the empiricists like Locke all share. Everybody throughout Western philosophy, more or less, up to the 19th century, agreed on the correspondence theory of truth in one form or another. But in the 19th century, people motivated by idealism came up with a different view, called the Coherence view. And here's one of its main advocates, a British philosopher named Francis Herbert Bradley. He decried facts as a vicious abstraction, the imaginary creatures of a false theory. And so he said, really, that's not the right way to think of this. After all, what do you mean, the fact that that's a triangle? Or the fact that the cat is drinking water from the glass? That's just being copied over from the sentence. That's nothing independent of the sentence. And so he says, don't think of that as a part of the world. Instead, all you're giving me is more language. So he puts it this way. A sentence or a belief is true if and only if it coheres with a comprehensive theory of the world. That is to say, this is something that forms a part of our theory of the world. Now, here I don't mean necessarily a big picture theory of the world that you get in philosophy class or in intro physics or something like that. Really all he means is, look, I've got this theory of the world, and in my theory is the cat is drinking water from the glass, or that's a triangle. And it fits right in with the rest rest of the theory. It makes good sense given the rest of the theory about the world. And so that's what it is for something to be true, just to fit into everything else we're saying about the world. Fit in the right sort of way, of course. Cohere with it. And exactly what that means turns out to be a hard thing to specify, but that's the general idea. This is an example of a philosophical move known as holism, where I say, in order to understand the part, I have to refer to the whole that it's a part of. Now, a lot of things, we do it the opposite way. Where I'm trying to understand this machine, let's say, and I have to look at the parts and see what the parts are doing. I analyze the machine in terms of the parts, you might think. But you might also think of it the other way and say, well, wait a minute, how do you know what that part is without referring to the whole machine? It's especially obvious with the body. What is a heart? Yeah. Ooh. Ah, all right, good. She gives two ways of thinking about it here. The first, looking at its parts, saying, well, it has 4 chambers and so forth. But then she says, and it pumps blood. Okay, so one of those explanations is looking at the whole and looking at its parts. But the other is saying, here's the function that thing plays in this larger system. And so a holist typically stresses that second kind of explanation. It says, don't explain the whole in terms of the parts. Explain the part in terms of the whole. Of course, you might have to do both at various points, and maybe both together in some cases, as with the heart. But you're at least in part to explain things in terms of their function in a certain context as part of a larger whole. Well, that's what the coherence theorist does with respect to language and understanding truth. To understand what I'm saying, you have to understand how I'm using those terms, how that assertion fits into a larger whole with my use of language. And just so, to know whether it's true, I have to see how it fits into my overall theory. So the thought is, I can't explain truth except in reference to an entire system of thought. I don't even know how you're using the terms unless I refer to this larger system. Well, enough on that. Enough on this. Let's go to Peirce and see what he actually does with this. Because he develops the pragmatic theory out of this theory by trying to improve. What do you mean, a comprehensive theory of the world? Something Bertrand Russell says. Couldn't there be lots of comprehensive theories in the world? Maybe I have a theory that's like this. Maybe I have a theory like that. Who knows? It could be that this sentence is true with respect to one comprehensive theory, false with respect to another. What do we do then? Peirce says, let's adopt a different principle, a pragmatic principle. He says, let's look at things in terms of the difference they make in practice. In fact, he says, look, there's no difference in meaning without a difference in practice. If you and I differ in meaning and what we're saying, it must be we do something differently as a result. If we don't do anything differently, there really isn't any difference in meaning. So the only differences that matter are differences in practice. Well, if that's right, then meaning depends on practice. It depends on what we actually do. And to get clear about our terms and our thoughts, we need to get clear about the practice, the practical effects they would have. So if somebody says, gosh, I think they're synthetic a priori truths, you basically say, well, so what? What difference does it make in practice? What difference does it make to me, man? And that's a pragmatic thought. It's not just to would. It's really an attempt to say, I don't even know what that means until you tell me what difference it makes. Now, in that case, I think there's an answer for that. But it does make a difference, because then there are things I can know about the world just by reflecting. I don't actually have to go out and investigate. And that matters to how I try to understand the world. Well, Peirce starts as a follower of Hegel, but he does two things. Okay, first of all, these higher level dynamic laws, he says they're strange, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You get the sense Hegel is kind of making this up, and sometimes it's insightful, but it's not really a very comprehensive theory. Peirce says, wait a minute, we have a view about how we change our ideas about the world, how we change our thoughts, our theories of the world. It's called scientific method. So the first thing he does is substitute scientific method for those higher level dynamic laws. And the second thing, that final stage of absolute knowledge, he says, I don't know if we ever attain that, but let's assume that's kind of a limit of inquiry. We can define truth in terms of that. The truth is what we would all agree on at that limit of inquiry. So the two big changes are to take those dynamic principles and say, that's just science. That is just scientific method. And then, this limit of inquiry, that's what gives us a definition of truth. So, here's a way of thinking it. Thought aims at truth. But also at other things. I often think about things in order to do something. so that it has a practical effect? Well, what kind of thought, what kind of practice aims at truth? The answer is science. Scientific inquiry aims at truth. It aims at stable belief in particular, a belief I'm not going to have to give up in the face of further investigation, further experimentation, further learning about the world. So a stable belief is one that I can continue to hold, and experience is not going to contradict it. Well, that's what scientific inquiry, he says, aims at. Yeah, that's just a joke. Okay, so here's what's really important about scientific method and what makes it different from other procedures. It's self-correcting. We do things in science, we experiment, we test our hypotheses, we do later research. Sometimes, in fact quite often, what we earlier believed turns out to be overthrown by later experimental results, by later theorization. And so we make observations, we formulate hypotheses, we test them by experiment, we revise them. And that process of correction is something you don't find in a lot of areas of inquiry. But it is something you find in science, which makes it converge in the direction of the truth. So here you see an experiment. In the old days, something very bad is going to happen to that poor bird. But now, here's another kind of experiment. Somebody invents the bulletproof vest and has the courage to try it out by having somebody shoot it with the vest on. That, you talk about courage. That's courage, okay? He is standing and fighting, well, not exactly fighting, and not running away. I'd run away, but anyway, that was in part how they convinced the police officers that these were worth using. Now, that's our goal, to formulate theories that survive those kinds of tests, that actually survive experimental tests. Einstein, for example, stressed this when he developed his theory of relativity. At first, special relativity, 1905, then in 1915, the general theory. And he said, look, don't just believe me. I'm going to change your ideas about gravitation. Gravitation is a matter of the shaping of space and time, its curvature. And so he said, here are three tests. The precession of Mercury, the deflection of light by the sun, and then the gravitational redshift of light. And he said, actually do the experiments. You shouldn't view this as acceptable until it's actually been confirmed by doing those experiments. And in 1919, on a famous expedition, people went to the Indian Ocean and actually did this, and the results came back agreeing with Einstein's theory. It actually turns out they made two mistakes, but luckily they canceled each other out. Either mistake on its own would have led them to come back and say, it didn't work out at all. But they made two mistakes, and so fortunately they came back, well, with this. Einstein's theory has given a tremendous jolt to the world of science. Here's the paper in which it was published, et cetera, et cetera. It made a huge splash. But why? Because it actually passed the experimental test. So, here's the general idea. The correspondence theorists define scientific activity as the kind of activity that aims at the truth. And Peirce turns that around. He says, I am doing the opposite. I am defining the truth as that at which scientific activity aims. So, somebody like Aquinas is going to think, look, there's such a thing as the truth, the way the world is. What is science doing? It is trying to describe the way the world is. And it's a special and highly reliable way of doing that. Peirce says, look, here's what's special about science. Not that it's somehow going to match the structure of the world. It's that it's self-correcting. That's what's special about it. And then, what is the truth? Whatever you get as a result of that self-correcting process. Now, of course, will we ever, in finite terms, get there? Maybe not. But think of it as the ideal limit of inquiry. If we're able to keep experimenting and do things right, then in the long run, the truth would be what we would get. So he says, the opinion fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by the truth. The objects represented in that opinion, those are the things that are real. Okay, so truth is a kind of coherence, but not just with some theory, whatever our comprehensive theory of the world is, with our comprehensive theory at that limit of scientific inquiry. At the final stage, or really I should say the limit of stages that we approach by doing science, engaging in this self-correcting enterprise, and finally getting closer and closer to something. That something we're getting closer to is just defined as being the truth. So the truth is what we're eventually bound to agree on if we engage in this kind of scientific inquiry. Now, Peirce is a fallacious. What we get out of this is never certainty. We can't be certain of anything, because it's always possible that some further experiment could overturn our results. Nevertheless, we can know things. we can gain knowledge because we can come closer and closer to that ideal end.